Alice Paul, the revolutionary suffragist, how one strike changed history forever. Alice Paul was a revolutionary suffragist who led innovative strikes, like her famous hunger strike, to reform the public's opinion about women's rights. The strikes she held inspired the actions of other suffragists and the methods that future revolutionaries took to instigate reform. Alice Stokes Paul was born on January 11, 1885, in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, to Tacy and William Paul. They raised her as a Hickside Quaker. This religion supported equal rights and was revolutionary in their ideals about suffrage. This was definitely a base for Paul becoming a suffragist and the foundation to some of her ideals. When the Quakers were founded, one of their principles was and is equality of the sexes. So I never had any other idea. The principle was always there. Alice Paul, 1974. Women being given the right to vote was a highly debated topic for many reasons. One reason was that some felt women were incapable of making decisions that had a major impact on the government. Another reason is that women were thought to be too busy with managing the home to stay up to date on current politics. While taking extra classes at the University of Birmingham, Paul saw prominent activist Christabel Pankhurst give a speech about women's rights, inspiring her to join the women's suffrage movement. Not long after, she met Lucy Burns, and the two became fast friends. Later on, both Paul and Burns joined the Women's Social and Political Union, or the WSPU, where they got their foundation for the militant protest strategy that they both developed. After she finished her schooling, Paul joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. NAWSA was founded by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and was the most prominent organization for women's rights when Paul came to the U.S. After she joined the organization, she was allowed to lead a protest. This protest, the Women's Suffrage Procession in Washington, D.C. on March 3, 1913, was a huge accomplishment. It was the largest protest held in Washington, D.C. so far, and was also held on the day before Wilson's inauguration. Making the news for days, it outshadowed Wilson's inauguration and caused quite the political headache. Regrettably, NAWSA also found Paul's strikes to be too radical, so she and Burns split off to form the National Women's Party in 1913. Despite their separation, the two parties still clashed frequently as a result of Paul's tactics, causing a sometimes negative reaction towards the suffrage movement, and because she secretly met with NAWSA members to convince them to join the NWP. During this time, Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of NAWSA, fought heavily to downplay the effects that Paul had, even saying, "I will fight you to the last stitch." Under the leadership of Paul, the NWP started its so-called militant striking, with the Silent Sentinel strike getting the biggest reaction, even if it was mainly negative. The Silent Sentinels, so named because they refused to speak, were a group of women that stood in front of the White House holding signs. This strike continued every day for 18 months. Over 1,000 women, including Paul, took turns standing outside. Rain or snow, they refused to budge. The strikes that the NWP performed were always peaceful, but on a regular basis they faced opposition. They were threatened and often physically harmed. However, maybe worst of all, the police arrested them instead of protecting their right to free speech and peaceful protest listed in the First Amendment of the Constitution. During World War I, the physical attacks got worse because the opinion of the general public was that women should not be protesting during the war and instead should be helping support the troops. Other organizations like NAWSA did this. They shifted the focus of the organization to helping the troops by knitting, organizing funds, and more. But the NWP continued their strikes. When men are denied justice, they go to war. This is our war, only we're fighting it with banners instead of guns. Alice Paul, circa 1917. However, because they continued protesting, they lost members. Nevertheless, they marched on, continuing their peaceful protests and strikes despite the violent opposition. Alice Paul was sentenced to 7 months in prison on the charge of obstructing traffic. This was the longest sentence any picket had received thus far, and part of the reason was due to the judge's tiring of her revolutionary tactics. Once she got to jail, she tried to open a window, because in the area where the suffrage prisoners were being kept, there was no fresh air. The guards reacted immediately, and she was held back from pulling the window open, so instead she instructed the other prisoners to start throwing things at the window, effectively cracking it, but nothing more. However, this was just a taste of what Paul was planning. Suffragists were treated worse than murderers, given spoiled, rotten, and tasteless food, most of it barely edible. They were even restricted from going outside to breathe fresh air or exercise. Because of this, many of the prisoners were sick or in poor health. Paul went on hunger strike to try and reform their conditions, even though she had recently been bedridden due to overwork. Though her peaceful protest eventually led to the suffragists receiving time outside, their treatment was still very poor, so she continued her hunger strike even though she was very sick. So they stuck her in the hospital wing and offered her the most delicious food, but she still refused to yield, so she was eventually force-fed. This was a gruesome process that involved sticking a tube down the person's throat and then funneling raw eggs or milk into their stomach. However, if the person refused to open their mouth like Paul did, then it was funneled down their nose instead. It was so painful that several people had to restrain Paul, and she ended up vomiting a great deal because of the pain. Rose Winslow, who was also in the hospital ward, joined in on the hunger strike and was also force-fed. "Miss Paul vomits much. I do too," she said later on. Alice Paul is as thin as ever, pale and large-eyed. Paul's health was definitely cause for concern. She was evaluated to be admitted to a mental hospital, but Dr. Walter E. Wright, who was sent to conduct the exam, concluded that she was perfectly sane and a brilliant revolutionary after listening to Paul speak. He said that she had a spirit like Joan of Arc and was perfectly calm yet determined. Because of this, he refused to commit her to a mental hospital. Paul encouraged many suffragists to act, leading to their incarceration at places like the Occoquan Workhouse and the D.C. jail. For example, one of the more traumatic experiences took place when the suffragists stormed the prison where Paul was being held. They were arrested and sentenced on November 14, 1917, dragged across a field, beaten, and thrown into moldy, rat-infested cells. They had little food and had to split a single cot between two people. Still, they chose these poor conditions if it meant causing a reaction that would help the suffrage movement. Luckily, people like Dr. John Winters Brandon assisted in representing them in court. His reforming arguments allowed them to get released early, even if some were released directly to the hospital because of their poor condition. Paul inspired many to reform their opinions on the women's suffrage movement. For example, Dudley Field Malone, a close ally of President Wilson's, reacted to the treatment of suffragists that was brought to light by Paul's actions. He resigned from his position as a member of President Wilson's staff and later on joined the NWP to fight for women's suffrage. A revolutionary thinker for his time, in his letter of resignation, he said, "In permitting splendid American women to be sent to jail, not for picketing, but on the technical charge of obstructing traffic, is a denial even of their constitutional right to petition for the federal suffrage movement." Dudley Malone, 1914. The incarcerated NWP pickets started touring around the country telling the public the true stories of their mistreatment in the prison. While the NWP was trying to reform the public's opinion, people like Dudley Malone were trying to reform the government's opinion. The vote on ratification on the 19th Amendment in Tennessee happened on August 18, 1920, where it would be passed by just one vote. The celebration of the members of NWP and NASA alike could be felt all around. The 19th Amendment was the foundation for many shifts in the lives of women. They would be able to file for divorce, own land, or open a bank account, actions that were previously restricted. The NWP was an organization founded by those who were keen to change the times no matter how impossible it might sound. The members of the NWP were revolutionaries in the world of civil disobedience, pioneering the ideas of both picketing the White House and peaceful protest in the U.S., which later would be widely popularized by the civil rights movement and reformers like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. Paul's strikes in prison helped reform the incarceration experience of others who had pursued her methods of instigating reactions. The Alice Paul Institute, API, was founded to support girls in their advocacy and encourage them to take action in their community. It works to preserve the history of brave women like Paul and create many opportunities for women in the world of politics. The ideals that Paul held continue through this institution as it works towards the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, which grants complete legal equality for women. Thus, Paul's legacy lives on, inspiring the next generation through this foundation and through her inspiring tales of bravery. Alice Paul was a very influential person in the suffrage movement. She formed the NWP, a group of radical women who worked to reform the public's opinion and the way that we fight to change the legislation. Her revolutionary tactics inspired both suffragists and others, leading to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Her motivating accounts continue to promote many activists both in their strategies and in their bravery.